Alright students, so today we are going to cover complex numbers. And let us start with something that you already know. So let's say we have the square root of 3 times the square root of 3. Well, you know that that equals the root of 9, which is basically 3. Okay? So if I have another number such as 6, root of 6 times the root of 6. Root of 6 times root of 6, well, we know that's root of 36, and that equals to 6. Okay, so there's a pattern here. The root of a number times the root of that same number is equal to the number inside, which we call the radicand. All right, so let's take that same idea and let's apply it to something like this. If I have the root of -1, all right, so -1, what would the root of -1 be? Well, what number could I multiply times itself to get a radicand of -1? It can't be -1 because -1 times -1 is +1. It can't be 1 because 1 times 1 is +1, not -1. And so in reality, this is not possible or not defined using our number system, the real number system. However, this does exist in some imaginary world. As a matter of fact, this right here, it's called an imaginary number. All right, so this is an imaginary number, and an imaginary number is defined as I equals the root of -1. So I is equal to -1. What happens when I have, let's say, -1 times -1? Well, based on this pattern here, based on these numbers, the root of -1 times the root of -1 is equal to -1. So we have two imaginary numbers. So I times I equals -1. In other words, I squared equals -1. Well, if we take that same idea, what would happen if I have I to the third? Okay, well, I already know that I squared times I to the first is I to the third, and I to the second happens to be -1 times I to the first. Let's go back up here. I to the first is just -1, root of -1. So what does that become? That becomes negative root of -1. All right. So what would happen if I had I to the fourth? Well, that would be the same thing as I to the second times I to the second. And I know I to the second happens to be -1 times -1 equals 1. All right. Take some time to go over that, please. Come back when you're ready. And then we have problems where you have to solve for a specific variable, such as x squared is equal to, actually let's do x squared plus 16 equals 0. And solving for x would require that I subtract 16 on both sides. So minus 16 on both sides. And that will yield x squared equals negative 16. All right, so to undo an exponent of 2, I basically square root both sides. And the root of x squared is just x. And that equals to positive or negative the root of negative 16. Well, the root of negative 16, I know it's not going to be a real number. I know it's going to be an imaginary number, so I could say negative 1 times 16. And you already know that the root of negative 1 happens to be I. And the root of 16 is 4. So your answer is plus or minus I4, or plus or minus 4I. That would be your answer. As a matter of fact, there are a few ways that you can solve this. If I have, for example, let's see, the root of negative 40. Notice how the negative is inside the radical. Well, I can say that that's the same thing as negative 1 times 40. And the root of negative 1 happens to be I. And so I am left with the root of 40. I know that the root of 40 has a perfect factor in there. I can say that 4 times 10 is 40. And so the root of 2 happens to be, or I'm sorry, the root of 4 is 2. Don't forget there's an I outside. And what's left? Well, what's left is root of 10. And this right here, this is set to be simplified. Simplified. All right, so keep that in mind. What if I have another example? What if I have x squared plus 9 equals 0? Solve for x. So let's subtract 9 on both sides. You get x squared equals negative 9. Square root both sides. And so the root of x squared is just x equals plus or minus. Notice this is a negative 9, so I know that it has a factor of negative 1 and 9. And the root of negative 1 is I. The root of 9 is 3. So my answer is going to be plus or minus 3I. Alright, feel free to pause that and come back to that later if you have to. Let's move on to the next portion of this lesson. Sometimes you're going to have something that looks like this, a plus bi. And this right here is what we call the complex form, or the imaginary form, where a and b are real numbers. The I, obviously it's imaginary. Okay, and you are going to be asked to work with something like this. So if I have y plus 4, times I equals 11I. And you have to find the value of y. Well, we know that this expression is being multiplied by I. So the opposite of multiplication is to divide. Divide both sides by I. That goes away, that goes away. And you're left with y plus 4 equals 11. Subtract 4 on both sides, and your answer is 7. Another example that we can look at is, let's say I have 5x minus 7 plus, let's say, actually let's do another one. Let's do 8 plus 3i minus 4 minus 10i. So what I have to do here is I have to distribute that negative. And so I get negative 4 plus 10i plus 8 plus 3i. Okay. Next step here is to combine like terms. Well, anything with an I is imaginary, and so these two are considered to be like terms. So I have 3i plus 10i, that becomes 13i. So this is done. This is done, and so now you have 8 minus 4. 8 minus 4 happens to be, well, it's just 4. All right, but remember that that form that we had up here, a plus bi, a plus bi. So we want the number by itself to be first. So 4 plus 13i will be the answer. And there's not much I can do anymore here because that's all I can simplify. What if we had 3 plus 2i times 7 minus 5i. Okay, so this is another example. Think about the FOIL method that you learned in Algebra 1. FOIL. Remember what FOIL stands for? It's first, outer, inner, and last. So first, multiply first this right here. All right, there's a negative right here. So we got 3 times 7 is 21. And then we do the outer. 3 times negative 5i. Well, that's going to be negative 15i. Then we do the inner here. So 2i times 7, and that becomes 14i. 2i times negative 5i. So negative 10i squared. Okay, so just like any other equation or fraction, or excuse me, any other expression, you always need to simplify. So these two are like terms. So negative 15i plus 14i, really that becomes just negative 1i. Don't forget there's a 21 right here. And on this side, we have this right here. We have negative 10i squared. Now remember what I squared is. I squared is equal to negative 1. Okay? So what we have here is negative 10 times negative 1. And I know that's equal to positive 10. Don't forget the negative I and the 21. You always have to simplify. These two are constants, so your answer is 31 minus I. And this is your final answer. There's a lot that we covered in this lesson. Just keep in mind that I is equal to root of 1, and I squared is equal to basically just negative 1. And the complex form of these numbers is a plus bi, where a and b are real numbers, and the I is your imaginary number. All right? Keep that in mind. Let me know if you have any questions. We'll see you guys very soon.